For most of the 20th century, the Soviet Union was one of the most feared powers on the planet. It was a huge bloc, and contrary to what many people think, it was not limited to Russia. It was made up of several republics: Ukraine, Georgia, Lithuania, Uzbekistan, and also Moldova, all under the same ideological umbrella: communism. In practice, it was Moscow that gave the orders, and anyone who dared to step out of line was silenced. This empire began to crack in the late 80s, and in 1991, it collapsed for good. The Soviet Union officially ceased to exist, and each country went its own way. Some became fragile democracies, others were more stable, some places plunged into chaos. And then there was Russia, which did not become a democracy, but did not descend into chaos either. On the contrary, it continued to concentrate power, as it always had. However, in this new map that was taking shape, there is a curious detail. A small piece of land that seems to have been frozen in time. A narrow strip where the hammer and sickle still fly on the flags, where plaques bearing the names of communist leaders remain firmly in place, where Soviet nostalgia is still routine. A place where, even today, people dream of the return of Mother Russia. And the strangest thing, this place isn't even Russian. It's not recognized as a country. And technically, it shouldn't even exist. But it does. And it has a name: Transnistria. And that's where today's Bello Mundo will take you, to a territory where the Soviet Union never came to an end. Number 1. Location and general information. The first difficulty in understanding this nation is knowing where it is, and as we already mentioned, it is not in Russia. Despite its complicated name and Eastern European accent, this little piece of land is squeezed between Moldova and Ukraine in a narrow strip on the banks of the Dniester River. Officially, Transnistria is still part of Moldova, but the story is a little more complicated, and we'll get to that in a moment. What matters now is to understand the extent of its isolation. Transnistria has no access to the sea, no tourist mountains, no international airport, and barely appears on official maps. It is a narrow territory, covering just over 1,500 square miles. It is roughly the same size as Rhode Island, the smallest state in the United States. It is one of those regions that you don't pass through by chance. Either you are going there on purpose, or you probably won't even know it exists. So much so that even Google Street View has ignored the place. There are no street maps, just a few scattered photos sent by curious tourists. The cities are small and modest. The capital is Tiraspol, a kind of Soviet showcase that seems frozen in the 80s. The signs are rusty, the architecture is all brutalist, the busts of Lenin are still in the squares, and old buses continue to run along wide, almost always empty avenues. But it's not just political isolation that makes Transnistria seem like a world apart. The climate also contributes greatly to this feeling. Winters there are harsh. Temperatures easily drop below -10 degrees, with biting winds coming from the Ukrainian steppe. In summer, the heat exceeds 35 degrees, turning the dry, yellowish terrain into a stifling oven. Humidity is low, rainfall is irregular, and the urban infrastructure, which is already not the best, suffers from this temperature contrast throughout the year. To top it off, Transnistria is located in one of the most tense regions in Europe. On the eastern side, Ukraine has been at war with Russia since 2014. On the other side, Moldova is trying to get closer and closer to the European Union. And right in the middle of it all is Transnistria, like a disconnected satellite, orbiting between two planets that are drifting further and further apart. And just as complex as its geography, climate, and isolation is the history of this place. Number 2. History. To understand why Transnistria exists, we need to go back to the late 80s, when the Soviet Empire was beginning to crumble. At that time, Moldova was still a republic of the Soviet Union. But as the communist bloc fell apart, several countries sought autonomy, identity, and independence. Moldova was no different. The problem was that within Moldova, there was a region that did not want to follow the same path. While the entire country looked to the west, flirted with Romania, revived the Latin alphabet, and bet on a more liberal future on the other side of the Dniester River, the mood was different. In Transnistria, the majority of the population was Russian and Ukrainian. There, no one wanted to become Romanian or abandon the Russian language. On the contrary, Soviet nostalgia spoke louder, and the idea of cutting ties with Moscow caused real fear. That's when the rift began. In 1990, Transnistria declared itself independent from Moldova, and of course, no one took it seriously. Neither the UN, nor Russia, nor any other country recognized its independence. But even without recognition, they stood by their decision. Moldova tried to regain control, and the response came in the worst possible way. In 1992, civil war broke out. On one side was the Moldovan army, trying to keep the country united. On the other were well-armed separatist militias with logistical and military support from Russia, even though the Kremlin denied any direct involvement. It was a short but brutal war. Soldiers, civilians, and innocent people died. Small towns became battlefields. And in the end, it was Russia itself that decided everything. Russian troops that had been stationed in the region since Soviet times took action alongside the separatists. As a result, Moldova retreated and a ceasefire was signed. Since then, Transnistria has functioned as an independent state, but only in practice. On paper, it remains invisible. Today, this piece of land has its own government, its own currency, its own flag, and even its own army. It is like a country, but without a recognized passport, a last bastion of what remains of the Soviet Union. A place where, while the world moved on, someone pressed the pause button in 1985. And this is not only evident in politics. It is in the appearance of the cities, in the monuments that still worship Soviet leaders, and in the rigid way in which local leaders control the territory. Number 3. Soviet life. Today, about 450,000 people live in this forgotten territory. It is a small population, but enough to keep a political, economic, and social system running that is completely separate from the country to which they theoretically still belong. Most live in Tiraspol. And if there is a time machine that you can visit without leaving the present, it is probably there. The capital of Transnistria seems stuck in time, like a school model forgotten in the corner of the room. The wide and almost always empty streets follow the urban pattern of the Soviet era, everything rectangular, pragmatic, and austere. The buses that still run are old models from the communist era, creaking over the uneven asphalt. Shop windows with motionless mannequins, which seem to have stopped in 1987, complete the scene. The store signs have that retro style that mixes abandonment with resistance, and they are all in Cyrillic. The buildings, huge concrete blocks, follow the same pattern. All the windows are the same, the facades are monochromatic, with almost no personal touch. In the city center, a life-size statue of Lenin faces the entrance to the government building. And this is not an exception, it is the rule. Soviet symbols are everywhere and appear on the official flag, coats of arms, military uniforms, and even bureaucratic documents. But it's not just decoration, it's part of the identity. While other Eastern European countries have torn down their Soviet statues, in Transnistria, they have been cleaned, preserved, and exalted as relics of a glorious time. Even with the internet working, in part of the city at least, Many people still live at a slow pace. Banks require paperwork. Public offices use manual records. The aesthetic is that of a living museum, but the minds of a large part of the population also seem stuck in the past. And this Soviet mentality extends far beyond the streets. Number 4. Worship of the past. In schools, for example, teaching follows the model of the former Soviet Union. Education is rigid, based on collectivity, discipline, and absolute respect for authority. Students sing hymns in Russian, learn history from a Soviet perspective, and in some institutions, still wear uniforms inspired by the communist youth. Commemorative dates also follow the red calendar. Victory Day, which marks the end of World War II, is one of the most important events of the year. Military parades take over the avenues. Veterans take to the streets with medals on their chests. Children raise red flags as if they were in Moscow in the 50s. May Day is also celebrated with marches, banners, and speeches extolling the working class and collective labor. But nothing symbolizes this nostalgia as much as the Transnistrian flag itself. It is the only European territory that still officially bears the hammer and sickle. That same symbol that represented the union between workers and peasants, which rose to the top of the Reichstag in Berlin in 1945 and once dominated a third of the planet. Here, it is not just a museum piece. This flag is everywhere. On public buildings, schools, uniforms, street signs, student ID cards, and even souvenirs sold to tourists who come to visit the country that does not exist. The cult of the past has become a cultural product. In Tiraspol, there is a museum dedicated to the former local KGB. Inside, spy radios, confidential documents, and a bust of Felix Dzerzhinsky, founder of the Soviet secret police, help keep the mystique of the Cold War alive. But this love of the past also goes hand in hand with a very present love. And that's where Vladimir Putin comes in. Number 5. The cult of Putin. While the hammer and sickle still fly on the flag, the most common picture on the walls of many homes is that of Vladimir Putin. Yes, him. President of Russia, former KGB agent, black belt in judo, and the one who appears shirtless in official photos as proof of his virility. Putin has become an almost mythical figure in Transnistria. There, he is seen as a protector, the guardian of that Soviet lifestyle that no one wants to abandon. For many residents, he is the one who can one day make the dream that has been whispered on the street corners of Tiraspol for years a reality: to annex Transnistria to Russia once and for all. And this is no exaggeration. In interviews, residents say in no uncertain terms that they want to go home. And that home is not Moldova, it is Mother Russia. This feeling grew even stronger after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Many people believe that the same thing could happen there, that Moscow will, at some point, cross the river and reclaim the territory it considers forgotten. But this devotion comes at a cost. Where there is idolatry, there is little room for debate. And where there is a lot of Russian influence, there is also usually little transparency. Number 6. Communist control. And where Russian influence is strong, transparency is usually low. In Transnistria, there is a president, there are elections, there are registered parties. But no one there is under any illusions. Politics functions more like theater, where the script is already written and actors who disagree with the script are cut from the play. Literally. In several recent elections, the main opposition figures have been prevented from running, prosecuted, or even arrested for administrative irregularities. And the most surreal thing is that even the communists themselves have been silenced. One of the most emblematic cases involves the former leader of the local Communist Party. Yes, the party that was most aligned with the dominant ideology. He was arrested for organizing protests against the government. In other words, a communist arrested for protesting in a territory that proudly displays busts of Lenin, Soviet Union flags, and portraits of Stalin in museums. It sounds like a joke, but it's the rule. Demonstrations require prior authorization. The press is completely controlled. There is no independent journalism there. Local broadcasters receive direct funding from the government, and any journalist who steps out of line, even just a little, ends up fired, prosecuted, or kindly invited to disappear. As a result, the climate of order is maintained, but along with it comes a climate of surveillance. It's as if the KGB never left. It has just changed its name and become more discreet. Those who live in Transnistria know this. They know who they can talk to, what they can say, what they should not comment on, especially if there is a foreigner nearby. Number 7. Russia is in charge but pretends it is not. Moscow's influence there is blatant. It starts with its military presence. Russia keeps troops stationed in the region under the pretext of peacekeeping, something that began in the 1990s, shortly after the conflict with Moldova, and has never ended. These soldiers were not invited by Moldova, much less by any international organization. But they are there, as if to say, try to remove them and see what happens. In addition to the military, there is the economic factor. Transnistria survives in large part thanks to direct aid from Russia. Subsidized natural gas, investments in infrastructure, payment of pensions, and even the shipment of supplies. It's like ideological sponsorship. Russia pays for the show, but pretends it has nothing to do with the stage. And whenever Moldova tries to get closer to the European Union, sign an agreement, or enter into alliances with the West, Russia's response is swift. It toughens its rhetoric and reinforces its special attention to the separatist region. In diplomacy, this has a name: frozen war. Transnistria is one of the so-called frozen conflicts in the post-Soviet space, along with Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia, or Donetsk and Luhansk in Ukraine. All these places have something in common. Russia is in charge, but without Moscow's signature on the contracts, at least for now. That is why many people consider Transnistria a puppet state. It has its own government, its own currency, its own flag. But it cannot take a step without Moscow's permission. Ultimately, it is as if Transnistria says, "We decide everything here," while Russia whispers in its ear, "As long as I approve." Number 8. A country with a passport that no one accepts. To conclude this tour, it is only fair to talk about the biggest contradiction of living in a territory that does not officially exist: international invisibility. In Transnistria, everything works as if it were a real country, but none of this is valid outside of it. Starting with the passport. Yes, they have a passport, cover, coat of arms, stamp, everything in order. Except that no one accepts it. No other country recognizes it. In other words, to leave Transnistria legally, you must have another nationality. Many people obtain Russian, Ukrainian, or Moldovan passports. Others simply don't leave. The same goes for the currency. The Transnistrian ruble is the official currency, but it is only valid within Transnistria. Outside of Transnistria, it is literally worthless. You can't even exchange it at the airport or at a Moldovan bank. It's like a video game currency. It only works within the game map. And the most curious thing, some versions of this currency are made of translucent plastic. That's right, plastic currency. It looks like a museum souvenir, but it can be used to buy bread, milk, and cigarettes. The local economy runs almost entirely on cash. International cards rarely work, and many ATMs don't even recognize foreign brands. Transnistria has its own central bank, its own postal system, exclusive license plates, and a telephone line with a different international code. Everything functions as if it were, in fact, a country, except that it is invisible to the rest of the world, a place where bureaucracy is real, but recognition is zero. And now I want to hear from you. Had you ever heard of Transnistria? Do you think this type of territory has a future? Or is it doomed to remain a geopolitical enigma forever? Comment below, because your opinion is very valuable. And of course, if you liked the video, leave a like, subscribe to Bello Mundo, activate the bell, and share it with someone who loves geopolitics, history, and crazy curiosities like this. See you in the next video.